Well, hello and welcome back to the All Saints podcast. Today what I'd like to do is to pick up a couple of loose ends from a previous sermon and a previous podcast, just develop a couple of ideas further. I want to talk a little bit more about discernment and a little bit more about baptism. Just to give you a heads up on the baptism piece, this flows from a sermon that I preached last Sunday as I'm sitting here on Friday the 12th of July. So Sunday the 7th of July I preached a sermon about baptism, a bunch of other things as well, and there are some questions that came in after that which I want to share with you. They were great questions, so we'll come to that in a couple of minutes. But before we do that, I want to pick up an issue and develop it a little bit further from last week's podcast, where I spent most of the time actually talking about a biblical picture of the relationship between men and women, but I prefaced it with some comments about the need for discernment. I pointed out that a lot of the questions that I've been asked on that subject, and actually quite a lot of other subjects, have been prompted by mostly online material, which just on a moment's reflection doesn't pass the smell test. I cited one example that was sent to me about a line of argument that suggests that because women are told in 1 Timothy 2 that they should be silent, and go back and listen to last week's podcast if you aren't sure what I think that means. But because of that, therefore, somewhere down the line, there's a train of logical, quote-unquote, inference that means we should abolish the 20th Amendment to the Constitution that guarantees no discrimination against women among the states when it comes to voting rights. I suggested that that kind of non-theologic argument just doesn't pass the smell test, and I urged you to exercise a little bit of discernment in what kind of things you worry about. Truth is, there's always going to be somebody wrong on the internet, and if you allow everything that's wrong to worry you, you're going to be worried a lot of the time. So there's discernment at that kind of level. Well, I want to talk about discernment from a slightly different angle now, and if last week was Discernment 101, in relation to the substance of the kind of things you might encounter, this week is, let's call it, Discernment 102, intermediate level discernment. Discernment in relation to how the teaching you encounter in different contexts might be designed explicitly, or at least have the effect of trading on emotional and cognitive vulnerabilities that all of us possess and we need to watch out for. What I have in mind, I'll give you an example of this, from the political landscape. It won't have escaped your notice that we're in an election year and that the choices that are before us are not exactly ideal, and moreover that there is a wealth of Christian commentary and opinion and prediction on the subject of the likely outcomes of our political woes and therefore what Christians ought to do about it. Now, what I want to raise is a question about the tone of some political coverage, not just among Christians actually, but it is centered among Christians, I think, some of this. And it's the kind of apocalyptic, the world is coming to an end vision of our political life. I don't want to deny that we are in unprecedentedly weird and flaky ideological times. I mean, those of you who are members at All Saints or who follow our media output will have heard me speak about critical social justice ideology a fair bit. And you know that I think that's quite a serious, big issue, both inside the church and outside the church. I'm very far from denying that we have some serious problems in the public square and we have some serious problems on the political landscape. What I want to take issue with, though, is the possibility that some of the coverage and some of the commentary on this material might be unduly alarmist. And alarmist because it's attempting, either deliberately or just because it's carried along by the way things are done, attempting to gain traffic in the most effective way. I want to offer an analogy from the financial world. And I think I heard this, I can't remember who I heard this from, but I remember hearing a financial commentator talking about tendencies which he'd observed in the financial and investment advice newsletter world over 10, 20, 30 years, in which economists, well, wannabe economists, and advisors with no skin in the game were, in his words, they had, in his words, successfully predicted 15 out of the last 3 recessions. And just pause for a moment and think what he's getting at. What he's getting at is the thought that there are kind of perma bears out there in the financial advice sector who are always hypothesizing, positing, claiming, predicting that we're on the brink of imminent economic collapse, and here's what you should do in order to protect yourself. If you want proof of this, just go back and search on YouTube more than 5 years, and then more than 10 years, and then more than 15 years ago for videos about gold investment. And what you'll find is that there's this kind of subculture of people who are predicting the imminent implosion of the US dollar, and the need to put everything you've got into gold bars and bury it somewhere in rural Wyoming as you await the apocalypse. Now, my point is not at all that we don't have economic problems, or that inflation isn't an issue, or currencies are being tinkered with by central banks. My point is none of those things. Of course those things happen and are happening. My point is simply that there is a tendency among economic commentators to overstate and overpredict the worst possible outcomes. And for some reason they get away with it. The reason they get away with it is because they're monetizing our anxiety, our frustration, our propensity to be attracted to bad news, or more broadly, news which prompts negative emotions in us. And this is exactly the effect, if not the intention, certainly the effect of quite a lot of Christian political commentary. It seems to me designed or to have the effect of monetizing our frustration, our anxiety, our tendency to feel the visceral frustration and pressure that comes from the ongoing assaults on our freedoms and liberty, and the ongoing pressure against our Christian way of life. We feel that very viscerally, and online commentary, material, analysis that feeds on those negative emotions gets more clicks, gets more traction, and generates more revenue, hence monetizing your anxiety, either directly because this stuff is actually for sale, or indirectly because everything's monetized if you can advertise on it. So this is ironic in a sense, because the social media companies discovered 15 or more years ago that they could design their platforms and design their algorithms to feed off this. And so you'll know, if you've read any of the really good analyses of how social media works, and certainly if you've watched The Social Dilemma, that movie, kind of documentary, you'll know that the way that social media companies design their systems is to promote content which is likely to generate traffic and therefore time on the platform and therefore advertising revenue. And they discovered a long time ago that we react more strongly to negative emotion than to positive emotion. You get this in the behavioral economics literature with biases in that where the human mind reacts more sharply to bad news than to good news. Loss aversion is an example of this. Well, what's happening is, again, I'm not suggesting that it's necessarily conscious on the part of Christian commentators, but I wonder if we've just found ourselves in a world where our instincts in producing online content, even as Christians, have been shaped by the realities of the economic landscape. And the realities of the economic landscape are that you generate more clicks and therefore you generate more revenue if you hypothesize that something terrible is about to happen. Something terrible is always about to happen. 15 out of the last 3 recessions. Now, there have been recessions, but there haven't been recessions every year. There are recessions occasionally, and we haven't had the 90% devaluation of the dollar that some gold bugs were predicting 10, 20, 30, and 40 years ago. And the weirdest thing is that the viewers of those financial materials never seem to hold those writers to account. They seem to overlook where the predictions of doom and gloom fail because, well, who knows, the next one might just be right, and who wants to be on the wrong side of an impending economic collapse? It strikes me that the same thing is going on, or could be going on, in the world of Christian commentary on political affairs. So I want to encourage you to exercise, this is where we get to Discernment 102. Discernment not just in relation to the content and the substance of the material, but to exercise discernment in how that material is affecting you cognitively and emotionally. And just before you click on the next doom and gloom apocalypse is around the corner link, ask yourself the question, am I exhibiting a kind of theological loss aversion? Am I exhibiting a propensity to be more easily provoked, more easily frustrated, more easily angered, more easily made anxious by this kind of negative news spin on world events than I ought to be? And the point is not, let me emphasize, the point is not objectively, is the political scene glorious and wonderful? Of course it's not. Neither is the scene inside the American church or the church across the Western world generally. The point is, how can we avoid getting an unbalanced view of the world and therefore avoid being distracted from the right kind of priorities that are going to keep us building the family, church, work, relational structures that will endure for 1,000 generations and will get us out of this mess the other side? That's a question I want to encourage you to ask. A question about what's driving me, what's driving you as you consume this online material. Discernment 102. Okay, so that's a bit more about discernment, a bit more about baptism, and actually a bit more about the Lord's Supper. So just to recap this, last Sunday, 7th of July, I preached a sermon called A New (brackets Old) close brackets perspective on baptism. And I pointed out, this is in Acts chapter 10, where Peter goes to Cornelius' household. I'll just recap the story for those of you who didn't listen to the sermon or haven't read that chapter of Acts for a few months. Peter goes to Cornelius' house. He's preaching a kind of outline of the gospel, really, to Cornelius and his family and his friends, and the Spirit falls upon them. And he concludes that, wow, if they've received the Spirit, who can withhold water for baptizing these people? The thought there, then, this is short-circuiting a more detailed exegesis, so go back and listen to the sermon if you don't trust me, or at least go back and look at the text, that'd be even better. But what you notice is, in Peter's mind, there is a connection between the gift of the Spirit, the presence of the Spirit, the outpouring of the Spirit on the one hand, and water for baptism on the other. Peter sees these two as connected. If they've had the Spirit, surely they need to have water. And I ask the question, well, where did he get that from? Where on earth might Peter have gotten himself the idea that water and Spirit come together? The obvious places you might think are Ezekiel 36, which is probably the passage in Jesus' mind, when he's talking with Nicodemus in John 3. He talks about being born from above and born of water and the Spirit. And Nicodemus is bewildered, and Jesus is like, how could you possibly not understand these things? You're supposed to be Israel's teacher. In other words, it ought to be obvious that water and Spirit go together. So you search through your Bible, you find a passage of Scripture where water and Spirit are mentioned. And of course, Ezekiel 37 is one of the few, but it's not the only one. Ezekiel 36, what I'm talking about. Ezekiel 36 is not the only one. It's against a background of Exodus, where I suggested water, the baptism, 1 Corinthians 10, of Israel in the Red Sea, and the Spirit, the glory cloud presence of God that led the people of Israel through the wilderness. And so what I pointed out was, in effect, Cornelius and his household are being invited on a second Exodus. They've received the Spirit. The Spirit of the Lord is leading them, not in front of them, but within them. That's one of the glories of the New Covenant. The Spirit is located not in a sanctuary that's separate from the people, but the people become the sanctuary, which is why the people catch fire in Acts 2. as opposed to the burning bush catching fire or the lampstand in the temple catching fire. The Spirit leads them, and they're led through the waters of baptism. That is what Peter infers at the end of Acts chapter 10. Okay, so that's Exodus. Now, a couple of other people, and this is... People at All Saints are very, very shrewd and thoughtful Bible readers. So they emailed me these interesting questions. And a number of people said, well, there's an earlier occurrence of water and spirit, isn't there? Genesis chapter 1, verse 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. Absolutely right. Water, the Spirit hovering over the water. Is that a connection too, Pastor Jeffrey? And the answer is, of course it is. Well done, well spotted. What it highlights actually is the Exodus itself and Christian baptism and filling with the Spirit are all new creations. The Exodus is the recreation of humanity in Israel, constituted as a nation to serve God in the wilderness and then in the Promised Land. Baptism and the filling of with the Spirit in the New Covenant is the recreation of Christian men and women and children. Come to that in a second. Baptism is new creation. If anyone is baptized into Christ, he's been clothed with Christ. If you're in Christ, you're a new creation, as Paul says in Galatians and 1 Corinthians. And I want to highlight this to encourage you. The fact of water baptism, the observable, tactile ritual of water baptism, is the sign, in the fullest and richest sense, of seal, the seal of the new creation, the renewal of the Christian man, the Christian woman, the Christian child. Look back to your baptism in the kind of Luther-like way of seeing God's work in you. You may not be able to remember the day of your baptism, but it's not your memory of it that matters. It's the fact of it in God's sight. He has renewed you in baptism. Now, that picks up, I mentioned a couple of times already, one other theme that I didn't actually make explicit in the sermon. I hinted at in the introduction, but then didn't draw the dots together at the end. And part of that was because my little pulpit stopwatch was reading 41 minutes, 37 seconds, and I thought probably that's long enough for anybody. But let me make this one more connection explicit, because it may be helpful for one or two people. The connection to infant baptism and infant communion that arises from seeing in the background of Act 10 this allusion to the Exodus, and actually to creation as well, but the Exodus in particular. Ask yourself this question. Which of the Israelites went through the waters of the Red Sea? That is to say, which of the Israelites were baptized? Which of the Israelites followed the Spirit cloud through the wilderness to the Promised Land? Was it just the adults? Or was it the children as well? Of course, obviously, it was the children as well. There's no way out of Egypt for men, women, or children except through the waters of baptism. And of course, just reversing the logic, it is the privilege of men and women and children all to be baptized in the Red Sea and led by the Spirit into the wilderness and then baptized again in the Jordan and led into the Promised Land. This typological background to Christian baptism helps us to understand the logic of infant baptism. It also obviously helps us to understand the logic of infant communion. Because what did they eat in the desert? Well, the adults, men and women, ate manna. Well, what did the kids eat? Correct, they ate the same stuff. Now, of course, some of them were being fed by their mothers when they were very, very small, but as soon as they're old enough to be weaned and couldn't subsist on just their mother's milk, they'd eat manna along with everybody else. The only way to survive in the wilderness is to eat the bread from heaven. And again, to reverse the logic, it is the privilege of men and women and children to be fed with the bread from heaven. Actually, that echoes the Passover in that sense. It's men and women and children. You have enough lamb at the Passover for the whole family. And just as the waters of the Red Sea prefigure Christian baptism, 1 Corinthians 10, so the manna in the wilderness prefigures the bread at the Lord's Supper. Think of John 6. The Jews come to Jesus and say, well, look, Moses gave us bread from heaven in the book of Exodus to eat. What sign are you going to do? And Jesus very famously in John 6 goes on to talk about the true bread that comes down from heaven is he who will give life to the world. Anybody who wants to have life must eat my flesh and drink my blood. It is a transparent and obvious reference to the significance of the Lord's Supper. So, just to gather all those threads together, the typological background in Exodus of Christian baptism not only establishes a solid biblical theological foundation for paedobaptism, it also establishes a solid Christian biblical theological foundation for paedocommunion, welcoming baptized children to the Lord's table. Notice one final observation. You've often, if you're at All Saints, you've heard me talk about paedobaptism and paedocommunion in explicitly covenantal contexts, drawing on Genesis 12, Genesis 17, Luke 1, Acts 2, those kinds of texts where the covenant promises of God are the basis for these, the welcome of children into the covenant at baptism and the feeding of children at the Lord's table. That's all true. Notice this is a second strand of argument which doesn't initially start with, let's look at the covenant promises. Instead, it starts with, let's look at how God works out these covenant promises in history. And this second strand of biblical teaching terminates with the same conclusion. So what you're starting to see here is the way that biblical theology generates systematic theology. For those of you who want the technical terms, biblical theology is like this kind of tapestry of developing themes through history, which are developed therefore through the Bible, because the Bible is history. And these together, as you step back and look at the whole thing, you see a sort of systematic framework, a big picture of what it is that we should believe about what God is doing in the world. And you can arrive at infant baptism and infant communion from both directions. Okay, well, I hope that's been helpful. And if you've stuck with us right the way through to the end, well done. I think that'll do us for now. The Lord bless you, and bye for now.